This is not a linear kind of problem that we're dealing with. This is very much an exponential kind of problem.
Right now, we're on the edge of 3 major tipping points. The first one is the Arctic ice cap. That ice cap's like a mirror. It reflects the sun's light off of the Earth and keeps it from warming us up. But as it melts, you get a smaller mirror, which means a warmer Earth, which means more melting, which means more climate change. Another example is Arctic methane. We've got a gigantic amount of methane gas frozen into the tundra, and it is 50 times as toxic as CO2 is. It's CO2 on steroids. As it warms, and that methane gets released, it then causes global warming to get worse, which means it warms more, which means more methane released, which means worse warming, and all of that process spins out of control. Another example of a tipping point is ocean acidification. As you get more CO2 in the atmosphere, a lot of it actually is going into our oceans. And a lot of stuff, like plankton, can't live in that kind of acidified water. And plankton is the basis of the food chain. If the plankton die, we lose the whole ocean ecosystem.
These kinds of feedback loops and tipping points are what keep me up at night, that we will hit one before we're able to turn things around.
Even if we went cold turkey today because of the time lags in our climate system, we've already signed up for things that we can't see yet.
We live in a razor.
Okay, now almost all of our calculations are linear. We're assuming that the Earth is increasing at a linear level, 2.2 parts per million per year, and it's going that way. But when these tipping points are breached, we could have exponential growth that just takes everything out of the realm of possibility for us. We're no longer are things predictable. So that's the danger of these feedback loops. So here's Greta summarizing this, and now we're going to start turning a little more positive. So if you've put up with me to this point, I promise you some degree of relief. You could have a pill, though, around this time.
End of my talk. And this is where people usually start talking about hope. Solar panels, wind power, circular economy, and so on. But I'm not going to do that. We've had 30 years of pep talking and selling positive ideas. And I'm sorry, but it doesn't work. Because if it would have, the emissions would have gone down by now. They haven't. Today, we use 100 million barrels of oil every single day. There are no politics to change that. There are no rules to keep that oil in the ground. So we can't save the world by playing by the rules. Because the rules have to be changed. Everything needs to change. And it has to start today. Thank you.
So Greta is very much a radical, and I noticed as I'm writing this book, I was becoming a radical as well. Because the situation kind of demands it. So this consensus is that we have to cut greenhouse gases 50% by 2030. That's methane to your left. That's CO2 to your right. We don't see any flattening of the curve, any bending of the curve, nothing. We are not turning anything around, and we have to go down 50% in 10 years. That is a huge challenge. So to your left is reality, going up and up and up. To your right, the fantasy that we will, we'll be at net zero at 2050, will it be at 50% in 2030? Everybody has their plans. But the fact of the matter is, we have not bent that curve at all. Now, there are solutions. There are conventional solutions that work: solar, wind, carbon taxes, conservation. A wonderful book, you're probably familiar with it, Drawdown, written by about 139 scientists. They looked at 89 different methods of reducing CO2. They calculated the feasibility, the cost, how many gigatons. They rank ordered them. It's a very important book to read. But there are also unconventional remedies that I talk about in my book that are a little bit on the fringe: rationing, wildfire management, the occupation of the Amazon and Indonesia, and population control. I'm only going to talk about a couple of these. So let's talk about the more conventional remedies now first. First, burning fossil fuels constitutes 92% of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we did what Greta said and we stopped it, okay, one way of stopping it is to have a massive buildup of solar energy. Solar panels have dropped in price 80% in the last decade. A solar farm costs less over its lifetime than building a coal-fired power plant. So how much do you need? We read in our paper that Trump is doing a demonstration project of 10 square miles. Wonderful. We need 21,000 square miles of solar panels to power the United States. We need 191,000 square miles of solar panels to power the world. But the good news is that if we're going for 50%, then we only need 95,000 square miles of solar panels to get a 50% reduction, which is roughly half the size of Spain. If you imagine or you fantasized of a global project, it's possible, it's doable, but it's a gigantic project, we have to admit. That is what we need to do to power the United States on a sunny day. That's how many solar panels are needed in that blue square. This is that large red square in Sahara. It's called Desert Tech. It's a fantasy, but it would power the world on a sunny day. And the second square would power the European Union. Also, though, we have wind power. Wind turbines are cheaper now than coal, than natural gas, and than nuclear. Furthermore, offshore wind power is 70% more efficient than land wind power. So how many do you need to power the world? Well, about 4 million. Okay. And there are many parts of the world that don't have enough wind to do the job. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Lester Brown. He was a brilliant environmentalist. I think he retired. He wrote a set of really good books. He was the one, I think, who made the first statement that we need to think globally. He said, we need to mobilize in a way we cannot imagine right now. He said in 1943, there were no Buicks that were made in Detroit. The entire automobile industry was converted in a matter of 3 years to building military equipment, 50,000 tanks, 256,000 airplanes. So to create the infrastructure and the mobilization of the entire economy is what is needed. That is what he argued in 2012. We haven't done it. We're not even close to it, but that's what needs to be done. So let's talk now about some of these controversial recommendations. Let's talk about rationing. Very few environmentalists talk about rationing. In World War II, Roosevelt rationed sugar and gasoline and electricity. Okay, so these were, and people had ration booklets. Imagine that you went to Safeway with a ration booklet and you're only allowed to buy so much beef per month. Let's talk about beef, cows, and methane just for a second. They produce 14% of global emissions.
And after this, we collect inside the bag.
So how long has that bag been collecting gas?
Only 2 hours. Methane is something like 22 times more potent as a climate changing gas than is CO2. So it doesn't take very much methane to make a difference.
A cow can basically fill up a 55-gallon garbage bag full of methane every day. One cow's not a problem, but now we have 1.5 billion of them. And it's an incredibly inefficient way of producing food. 3/4 of agricultural land is used just to feed livestock. When you factor in everything, the clearing of the land for grazing, feeding, transporting, Livestock causes more greenhouse gases than all the direct emissions from the entire transportation sector. I don't think it's a
more than cars. So, who are the major beef eaters in the world? The United States, Canada, Argentina, Australia, and New Zealand. Those are the major ones. Japan is 28th. China is 47th. The average American eats roughly 800 hamburgers a year. We're fourth in the world. Now imagine that we decided to ration beef to 50% of its current consumption. Okay, if you had, you only could buy half as much beef as you're currently buying. Americans could still eat one hamburger a day. That's how much you'd be alive. It's not that much of a sacrifice, but that by itself would, along with New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and so forth, would reduce global emissions 7%. And we're only shooting for 50%. That's an awful lot. It could happen just with a change of policy. So how are we doing? Now, I've cut this lecture down because Gary wanted me to keep it under a certain level. So here is a summary of just what has been sort of covered here. Solar and wind could reduce emissions 45%. Rationing, beef, electricity, gasoline could take us down so that the total just from these is 71%. In other words, it's all very, very doable. We could do this. We could achieve that standard. And in addition, in my book, I talk about 20 promising technologies that are very, very interesting, very intriguing: solar power, electro swing absorption technology, bioplastic, algae biofuel, air batteries. They're not practical yet, but in 2 or 3 or 5 years, they could become very, very interesting. However, kind of getting back to some of the bad news, things are, we're in an emergency. I don't know how to say it more politely. Here are a few people who have said as much. Jim Bendel, professor of sustainability leadership. Climate change is now a planetary emergency posing an existential threat to humanity. There will be a near-term collapse in society with serious ramifications. Catastrophe is probable, extinction is possible. Those are very, very strong words. Bill McGibbon, you are familiar with him. If we don't act quickly and on a global scale, the problem will literally become insoluble. So Angela Merkel appears on New Year's Eve, all dressed up. You thought, well, she's going to wish the German people Happy New Year. It was New Year's Eve. No, she didn't. She said climate change was a real dangerous emergency that we need to look at now. 11,000 scientists in November signed a declaration warning of a catastrophic threat to humanity. That is an awful lot of scientists. So here are a few more radical solutions. I'm hoping to warm you up to these more radical ideas. One was the occupation of the Amazon basin. I'm not talking about that, not enough time. The other is the occupation of Indonesian, Malaysian provinces where palm oil is, where those fires are occurring. Well, I'm not going to talk about that either. A third is the development of wildfire supertankers, and a fourth is banning fracking. Let me talk about those last two. Wildfire response teams and supertankers. For example, last year there were 72,000 fires in Malaysia and Indonesia. There were 78,000 fires in the Amazon, releasing CO2 into the atmosphere, and CO2 levels are going up. 2 million acres in the Amazon were burned to the ground last year. Dmitry Medvedev, the president of Russia, now no longer the president, said about his fires in Siberia, we can't reach them. You can't get to them to put them out. But most of the planes, which are very effective, have a range of 150, 200, 300 miles. But there are super tankers. There are two, which are the Aleutian 76 and the 747. They have been converted. They can carry 20,000 gallons of water and fire retardant. They can fly 4,000 miles, 2,000 miles there, 2,000 miles back. The United States has 13 of them. Last year, Bolivia rented one. Okay, they're very expensive. But what if we made a decision that these fires need to be put out? Naomi Klein says, get a goddamn fire hose, okay, in her book on climate change. So we need to put these fires out this summer, in the Southern Hemisphere and Northern Hemisphere. If we had 100 super tankers and 18 staging areas in Canada, Siberia, Australia, Africa, Indonesia, we could do it. It doesn't cost that much. It's possible. There's just no will. But in Australia, last summer, they had huge fires. 25 million acres were burned. That's an area the size of South Korea, burned to the ground in Australia. And there was a petition circulating in Australia. Why not use a supertanker 747 to fight bushfires in Australia? And there was an organization, change.org, trying to raise the money to do that. You need more than one supertanker to address this problem. All right, my second controversial recommendation, and then we will go on to other things. I'm giving you two of the radical sides of this book. Banning all fracking. This is a graph of methane. Okay, if you look at that arrow, it shows that methane leveled off around 2000. But then the United States started its shale oil industry and fracking, and methane started to skyrocket. It went up 8%, and 80% of that increase is caused by the United States of America and the fracking industry. And that methane gas is 34 times more potent than CO2. So we need to just stop and ban fracking. And there's one guy who talked about that.
I don't have to explain to anyone here that the growing body of evidence tells us that fracking is a danger to our water supply, our most precious resource. It is a danger to the air we breathe and can cause lung cancer. It has resulted in more earthquakes. It is highly explosive, and it is contributing to climate change.
So I'm not the only radical in the family. So what does it all mean? If we put all these things together, it means one thing. Hope is very, very rational. It is very rational to say we could still stop this problem. We have the technology. We know that it could be done. All we lack is the resolve and the will to do it. So I'm going to conclude somehow now. We're going to start talking about denial. This is where I started my interest in global warming. And there's bad news and good news. I'm going to save the good news for the end. And here's the bad news, some more bad news. We're going to, okay, these are the real climate change deniers. We think of a climate change denier as someone from who's an uneducated, scientifically illiterate person who watches Fox News obsessively. It's actually the most effective climate change deniers are very, very intelligent people, okay? They're people in the business community. They're people who read these magazines, who watch these television programs, who read these journals, who invest in the capitalist world, okay? Now here, I'm gonna suggest some, what I call global warming pornography. Here it comes from the business community. Fracking will increase 3.6% every year until 2030. Wall Street says, oh my God, Wall Street Journal, CNBC, Jim Cramer, look at that, let's invest in the shale industry. This is a growth industry, is it not? Well, if fracking increases 3.6% every year, doesn't that mean methane is going to increase 2, 3, 1% every year? How are we going to reduce this from 50% down 50% if we see fracking taking off? Plastics production will grow 40% by 2030. Cheered by Wall Street, US oil production will increase 46% by 2030, chief economist of ConocoPhillips, Helen Curry, says. US oil exports will increase 50%. So my question to Helen would be, Helen, what asylum are you living in? You're just saying that and people are cheering and people are investing, and where's the consciousness that needs to be here in this discussion? The United Nations says there will be a 150% increase in coal by 2030. Steel production will increase 60% by 2030. The American trucking industry foresees a 25% increase in trucking demand by 2030. Even though the average SUV gets only 22 miles a gallon, it is estimated by General Motors that sales of SUVs will double by 2030. So I thought